You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.
She's probably had too much to drink and fallen asleep on a deck chair. That's the joke that Diane Brimble's sister made the morning after their first night on board a family holiday, a cruise to Noumea that had just departed from Sydney. The 42-year-old mother of three from Brisbane was sharing a cabin on board the Pacific Sky with her sister, Alma Woods, and their two daughters. The siblings had been planning this 10-day cruise for 2 years before finally boarding the liner on the 23rd of September 2002. They enjoyed a small celebration together as the cruise set sail and passengers were treated to some welcome aboard drinks. Alma opted for an early night and escorted her daughter and niece to the cabin to turn in, while Diane carried on mingling. The next morning, Alma noticed Diane wasn't in her bed. She was curious about what her sister might have gotten up to, but wasn't too worried. Until Alma heard an emergency call sounding nearby. She followed the loudening calls to a cabin as an alert beamed through the ship's loudspeaker. Her stomach began to churn.
General emergency alarm.
Just as panic was setting in about her sister's whereabouts, Alma turned a corner and was confronted by the scene of the commotion. Medical staff were huddled around an unconscious woman, fighting to revive her. Alma was blocked from getting closer, but she saw enough to raise the alarm that her sister did not sleep in her cabin last night. Alma Woods goes into complete shock when moments later, a nurse tells her that the woman is dead. Her sister, Diane Brimble, is dead. I'm Emma Gillespie and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. On the 23rd of September 2002, Diane Brimble stepped aboard what should have been a 10-day cruise through New Caledonia and Vanuatu. But within less than 24 hours, Diane was found unconscious in a stranger's room. The cabin belonged to 4 men travelling as part of a bigger group of 8, the Adelaide Eight as they'd soon become known. A group of young men ready to indulge in the vices of the infamous party cruise industry, a hotbed of uninhibited holidaymakers fueled by drinking, sex and drugs. The death of Diane Brimble exposed a dangerous culture on board these ships, but the mystery surrounding her final hours would lead to a search for answers for the better part of a decade. Author and crime reporter Geisha Jacobson explores the death of Diane and the 8 men she met on her last night alive in her book Abandoned, The Sad Death of Diane Brimble. Geisha joins me today. And please note this episode contains discussion of sexual assault, drug use and violence. Listener discretion is advised. Most Australians have a pretty clear picture in their mind when they hear the name Diane Brimble. But what can you tell me about Diane Brimble, the person? What was she like?
We obviously rely on the evidence of a diverse group of people to tell us that. And I think to some extent this is at the nub of the mystery of this story. We have her family and friends that describe her as conservative and prudish, and we have evidence from some of the passengers on board the cruise ship that describe her as rather forthright and flirtatious. But I think what everybody agrees on was that she was fun, she loved company, she was interested in people, she was good at making small talk and getting a party started, she loved dancing, and she was clearly a devoted mother and quite a family-oriented person.
What was her life like before she boarded that ship?
She had been married for a few years to a man called Mark Brimble. She had 2 children with him, and then she was in a much longer relationship with a man named David Mitchell and had another child, a daughter, Talia, who was also on board the Pacific Sky. They had an on-off relationship, and they had broken up a short time before the cruise, but still had remained in touch.
Where was she headed on this cruise? Who was she with? What was the plan of attack?
She was part of a party of 12, which included her sister Alma, her niece, and her own daughter Talia, and some other family friends. And the cruise was South Pacific cruise going to Noumea and Vanuatu.
Do we know how old her daughter was?
Talia was 12.
Was it typical for Dianne to be heading on a holiday like that? Was that something that she had really worked and saved towards?
She had saved for this cruise for a number of years. It cost her over $2,000 for her and Talia, and it was hard for her to save that money. She would have wanted to take her sons as well, but that just wasn't in the budget. She was working full-time, but she was a single mum of 3. So money was tight. So it was something she'd very much looked forward to. But then there's also evidence that a short time before the holiday, she suddenly had a premonition. She suddenly felt that something bad was going to happen, something was going to go wrong. And she was a bit concerned about it and raised it with a friend.
At the same time that Dianne is boarding this cruise with her group of friends and family, there are 8 men from Adelaide also joining the cruise. What do we know about that group?
They were a slightly diverse group. To book a cruise in the sort of cheaper cabins, you need 4 people per cabin. And so a couple of the people in this group weren't part of the regular circle. So there was a bit of a core and then a few others. But the core group were a bunch of guys who had worked out together at gyms, who had associations with providing security at nightclubs, who saw themselves as sort of quite outgoing. And there was some evidence about potential drug taking and associations of some of those men that weren't mainstream. It's a little unclear what brought these guys together. Mark Wilhelm had recently turned 30, so there was a bit of speculation that he thought going on a cruise and then putting a few friends together, and it just grew from there. But definitely some of those guys were very quickly introducing themselves to the good-looking girls on board and making their intentions pretty clear.
Does that speak to the culture on these sorts of ships? What reputation did cruise ships have in the context of 2002?
I think in cruising generally there's a couple of different markets. There's the sort of high-end market and retiree market, but there was definitely part of the advertising being targeted at a young, single market, and there was an advertisement showing a postcard with bikini-clad young women using a pun that had a sexual connotation. And one of the 8 guys from Adelaide said at the inquest into Diane's death that he had heard a slogan, and I don't know whether I can use this word on this podcast, but that called it P&O the fuck ship. So there was a clear intention that perhaps some people were there to meet members of the opposite sex and engage in some fun.
If you do fall into trouble on a cruise ship, as we know Dianne Brimble did, what protections are in place? Or at least in 2002, who was in charge? Is being out at sea kind of lawless?
No, there is an international convention about laws of the sea, and there is a reasonably firm rule of jurisdiction. So The incident and Diane's ultimate death happened within 100 kilometres of the New South Wales coast, which means it was New South Wales waters. So that's clear for starters. Beyond that, in international waters, it becomes a little bit more controversial. But in general, the captain has power on board, and in this case, even predating some extensive and necessary reforms of the cruise industry. There was security on board and there were certain procedures. Clearly, there were some mistakes being made and things didn't go to plan. But, short of having police on every cruise, and that was a suggestion that was floated by the inquest, you rely on the private sector on board.
We know that Dianne Brimble died within 24 hours of boarding. Can you take me through that day?
They boarded in Sydney and there was a going away party on board the deck as they left Sydney Harbour, and then there was dinner, and then people could go to what was then called the disco, which I think nowadays we would call a nightclub, and people mingled. Everybody was new, everybody was trying to get to know each other. There was music playing. It sounded like a really good time. Dianne obviously had her daughter with her, and her sister's daughter was there as well. The sister Alma retired early in the night because she wasn't feeling well. So the kids were looked after. They were in the cabin with her for most of the late night and so on. So that was all taken care of. So Dianne could go out with another person from her group and start to enjoy herself. She went to the nightclub and met a number of people there, and ultimately ended up talking to part of our group of 8 men, which included Dragon and Mark, and started talking to them. And the nightclub closed at 4:00. And from then on, some of the versions of what exactly happened are probably contradictory, but let's just go with a few basic facts. She went to the cabin that Mark, Leo, and some of the other boys shared. She had sex with Mark, and there are photos of that. And then some hours later, she lay on the ground between the bunk beds on the floor. She had defecated and she was clearly dying. And in the early morning, eventually some help was called. It was attempted to revive her and she had died.
What was the cause of death?
Well, initially, when the doctor on board examined her, they thought she had had a heart attack. Eventually, her body was taken to Sydney for a post-mortem, and it was found that her cause of death was a mixture of the effects of alcohol and a drug called GHB.
What is GHB?
I guess you'd call it a party drug. It is a drug that's manufactured from substances used in the paint industry. It used to be used as an anesthetic, but it was quite unpredictable and had some side effects that led to its use being discontinued, and then in the 80s became used by bodybuilders, and then the 90s became more of a party drug. But some expert called it a very dangerous drug because its use was so unpredictable. It's apparently quite fast acting, but it's really hard to dose. So the line between a high and falling asleep and ultimately potentially having your breathing suppressed is quite narrow. And obviously different people react differently to drugs as well.
In the immediate aftermath of Dianne's death, what was the reaction on board? Were passengers notified, and how did her family find out?
Passengers were not told, and that led to a lot of rumours spreading on board. Obviously, her family were told, but it so happened that her sister actually came across the scene of the doctors, not quite in public view, but nearly in public view, working on her, trying to resuscitate her in the room with the door open, and Alma was standing at the outside of the corridor, sort of looking in that direction, not knowing it was her own sister that was in trouble. But eventually, obviously, the family was told.
Do cruise ships have the facilities for these kinds of things happening? Did the boat turn around and come back to Sydney? Where was Diane placed?
This cruise ship had a small hospital room, and that was used for that purpose. Her body was offloaded at the first stop and taken back to Sydney, and that opportunity also was given to her family to leave the ship there and to come back.
Was there any reason at that time in those early stages for the incident to be treated as suspicious? Was a crime scene established? Or from your research, was it pretty clear that security present on the boat, the medical professionals on the boat were all comfortable and willing to write it off as a heart attack?
No, it was actually treated as a suspicious death relatively quickly, because as the doctor and nurse who had worked on Diane started to look around the cabin, they discovered a small pill, a drug. It later turned out to be temazepam, so not anything sinister as such, but because they didn't have the facilities on board to know what it was, they did put on the death certificate that it was a suspicious or unknown circumstances or something like that. So the cabin should have been secured and should have been locked to preserve the scene, given that there were now some questions about the cause of death. And it seems, depending on your point of view, a misunderstanding or some deliberate action between the security on board, another staff member called the purser, like a hotel employee, so to speak, if you consider the ship a hotel. And because the cabin had been booked by these four men, they obviously had their belongings in there. They were hotel guests that needed to be accommodated somewhere else, and they asked for access to their belongings, saying they needed access to their medication, and they were ultimately allowed into the cabin to remove their things, including, by the sound of things, some drugs.
Was anything else removed from the cabin at that time? You mentioned that photographs were taken of Diane engaging in sex with one of the men. What happened to the camera?
The camera belonged to one of the guys out of the 8, obviously staying in the other cabin, but somehow they lost the memory card. And in a stroke of good fortune for the inquiry, that was found and handed in and ultimately handed to police and examined, and they managed to retrieve deleted photos from this memory stick. And they went some way to showing the events of the night and shedding some light on what may have happened to Diane.
At what point did the 8 men, and more specifically Mark, become the persons of interest here, the suspects? What was the investigation that followed?
The investigation started when the owners of the ship called New South Wales Police and reported that there had been a death and it had been deemed as suspicious. 2 police officers from the Water Police and a couple of forensic officers came on board the ship in Noumea and started investigating, started interviewing people. Ultimately, that inquiry was handed over to the homicide squad, and the inquest into Diane's death obviously also probed into the circumstances and tried to make findings of fact into what actually happened in order to, obviously tell the family what had happened, but potentially find out if a crime had been committed that would then need to be referred to police and ultimately the courts.
There have been many criticisms over the years about the investigation, the early phases. In that time when police were flown to Noumea to interview those on board to see if they could find out the truth, one of those detectives was caught on the dance floor. He became known as the dancing detective, drinking cocktails when he was meant to be on the job. What does that tell us about the initial stages of this investigation, if anything?
I think it tells us that the police officers are human beings too, and that they don't work 24/7. Also, they said they thought they might be able to make their presence known to people by being approachable, by being part of the group and blending in a bit, especially if people were scared and were able to approach them in something of an informal setting. In how far that is an excuse after the fact, I don't know, but I'm just trying to paint both sides.
I mean, it's an interesting counter perspective to obviously the media of the day. We're all over that.
Yeah.
Mark Wilhelm is someone who we know had contact with Dianne Brimble in those early hours on board the ship. Who is he and what do we know about his version of events?
Mark grew up in the north of Adelaide. He's a fitter and turner, I think, and he's worked in a number of industries. And like some of the others, he was into going to the gym and did some security at nightclubs as well. Mark never gave a version of events in the sense that he didn't give evidence at the inquest and he didn't give evidence at his own trial. The only version we have from Mark is what he said in telephone calls that were intercepted at a time when arguably the men could or should have known that their phones were being tapped by police. And sometimes they sounded like they were being a bit careful in what they said, and sometimes they sounded like they didn't give a damn and they were just letting it rip. But ultimately, so many phone calls were intercepted, and I've listened to, I think, all of them that were made available. And it's hard to believe that these guys, based on everything else we know about them and we hear in these calls, could have sustained lying for such an extended period of time. So if we take that at face value and say there is somewhere in there the version of the truth, I think the short version is that Mark had met Dianne in the nightclub. She had taken him into the toilets to give him oral sex. She didn't want to go back to her cabin, so she didn't wake the children and asked if she could come to his cabin. At some stage, a drug, GHB, was consumed by some people, including Mark and Dianne. Mark had sex with Dianne, and in that time, some other people came into the cabin and took photos. It's not quite clear who, and it's not quite clear what else may have happened. And then Mark and some of the others left the cabin and Dianne was asleep on the bed. At some stage then Dianne was on the floor and in trouble and ultimately died. So I think that's the bare bones of what we know, and there are things we will never know.
When you mentioned that you had listened to as many of those phone calls between the men as you could, and that it's hard to believe that they could sustain a lie for so long, what do you mean by that? What impression did they give you?
Oh, they were rehearsing versions, clearly. There were some things that they didn't want to say. They were trying to make sure that other people were on the same wavelength as them when it came to what the official version was going to be. And that was mainly around the issue of the drugs. Who had brought the drugs on board? Whose drugs were they? Who had had drugs? When? Why? Where? And so on. And I think it came to minimizing the role of some of those. But There was, I think, never any discussion or dispute in these versions about the fact that it had been all consensual, that Diane knew she was consuming a drug and she did so willingly and knowingly, and that she had willingly engaged in sexual intercourse. So this version that she was drugged and she was raped, it just doesn't appear anywhere in these phone intercepts. And when I say I can't imagine these guys could have had that many conversations, like hundreds and hundreds of conversations over 18 months or so, and not once let something slip, it just doesn't make any sense. And it's not my opinion as such, but the courts as well found there just wasn't the evidence to support anything other than that she had willingly engaged in sexual intercourse and she had taken the drugs willingly.
The issue of consent is a big theme around trying to understand this case and what happened. What stories contradict perhaps that line from those men that she had willingly taken the drugs, had willingly engaged in sexual acts? What do her family say about that? Is there any proof that consent may have been lacking?
There's probably three parts of approach to this, three elements of what could contradict it. One is what the family said, one is what the forensics said, and one is what other passengers said. So I'll walk you through those. Her family were very clearly of the view that this is not the person they knew. This is not something she would have done, she ever did. There was some evidence, again, to contradict that in the evidence by her GP, to whom she had confided in having unprotected sex a couple of weeks before the cruise and a one-night stand a couple of weeks before then, and she sought medical treatment for related issues. So it's not as clear-cut, perhaps, but the other part of that is, how well do our former husbands know the people that we are nowadays? It may not be the best evidence what your mum and your sisters know of you or your former partners. The second part of this, the forensics, are very, very difficult. GHB is a drug that continues to be produced in the body after death. So it was very hard to determine what levels she had consumed because it took so long for her body to come to autopsy back in Sydney. And it wasn't just the drug. She died of the combination of the drug and the alcohol. So any conclusions about was she given the drug in a drink in the nightclub because the timing would line up that way.
You mean that it may have been spiked?
Yes. None of those conclusions could be drawn from the data. One of the experts at one stage made such a statement, but the other experts disagreed with him, and ultimately they said you couldn't conclusively make those comments. So again, there's a big question mark about all of that. And thirdly, and perhaps most disturbingly, there were passengers that came forward years after the event that said they had heard noises, voices that they attributed to Diane or the cabin that she was in. They couldn't identify her voice, obviously, and they hadn't seen anything, but they had heard movements and they had heard words like no, no, and I'm not like that. I don't do that sort of thing. But we don't know if it was her. We don't know what it referred to, and we don't know what happened as a result of that. Again, it's disturbing, but it doesn't amount to something that is evidence that stands up in court.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Emma Gillespie. I'm speaking with Geisha Jacobson about the death of Dianne Brimble. An inquest into Dianne's death started in March 2006, so 3.5 years after her death. For many of us, that was the first time that we had heard about this story. It gained a lot of media coverage, the public started to learn about what happened, and the 8 men involved were kind of painted as these quite unsavoury characters. So, the Adelaide Eight, this sort of antisocial social club, a group of guys going on a ship to drink, sleep their way around. How significant was that media coverage at that time? And did it persuade the court of public opinion?
I think it was huge. It started with the sensational opening at the inquest, because before the inquest started, there was very little publicity of this case. But because the counsel assisting in the inquest said she was drugged and she was raped for the sexual gratification of others and abandoned and left to die, that is just absolutely horrific. And of course, it stirred the sympathy and the public emotion. And then the story had everything. It had photos, it had colourful identities, in a sense that these guys could be vilified. And so it just grew bigger and bigger. But as the evidence unfolded, it seemed to me, as a reporter who was in court every day of the inquest, that at some stage the evidence went one way and the media never caught up. They were still so caught up in this story of she was drugged and she was raped and left to die that they didn't tell the public enough about the fact that, hang on a minute, the evidence is now showing us some other options here.
For those who might not really understand it, what's the actual purpose of an inquest?
Yes, the inquest is designed to find out a number of things: the name of the person who's died, the date they have died, and the manner and cause of death. And obviously that was the real focus of this inquest. And then it has the option of referring matters to the DPP if they find there are some potential charges that could arise that somebody had committed a crime. I think the coroner, Jackie Millage, wanted to bring something to the family to help them understand and give them some feeling of justice. And maybe she had an inkling that it was the only way of, in some way, making some of these men pay, in air quotes, for what they were perceived to have done. But officially, an inquest should just do that, determine the person, the time, place, manner, and cause of death. But in doing that, it can use investigative techniques and can compel witnesses in a way that a normal trial can't. So quite often inquests have been used and are being used to probe further and to find that closure of where is the body, who committed this crime, things that are otherwise left forever hidden. And that inquest went for a very, very long time, an unusually long time, and generated an unusually large amount of publicity and witnesses, and was quite heavily criticised in legal circles as well as being extraordinary and run in a way that many people didn't agree with.
As the inquest was unfolding, some charges were laid against some of the men, the Adelaide Eight. What were the charges laid against Mark Wilhelm?
Initially, 2 charges were laid against him, one in relation to drug supply and one charge of manslaughter. So the DPP tried to argue that he was responsible legally for Dianne Brimble's death. And Manslaughter can be proven in a number of different ways under New South Wales law. One is by negligence, gross criminal negligence. This would have to do with the time when they knew she was lying on the floor, she had defecated, potentially a sign of death or trouble, and very little was done. She was then showered and dressed before help was called. So was there some delay in getting help? Should they have known better? Anything like that. But ultimately, the lawyers abandoned that because under law, the idea of a duty of care in these circumstances does not exist, nor could they prove the time of death. So they couldn't be sure at the time the guys became aware that she was on the floor. She might have already been dead. So there's no more negligence at that stage. The second way of arguing manslaughter in New South Wales is by a dangerous and unlawful act, and that would involve the administering of the drug GHB. There were problems with that argument too, because A, the guys argued she'd taken it willingly, and B, because she didn't actually die from GHB. She died from the combination of the alcohol that nobody argued she hadn't taken willingly, so the causal link there wasn't quite there either. So that left a really difficult decision for a jury to make, and in the end, the jury couldn't reach a verdict.
After that hung jury, how was it decided that the manslaughter charge would be dropped? Was there a possibility for a retrial?
There was, and it was probably the most bizarre day in court that I have ever witnessed as a long-time court reporter. It went from people digging out an old-fashioned charge to the judge basically telling the DPP that that charge couldn't possibly stand and he wouldn't allow it. And in between, it felt like Mark was actually going to plead guilty to it. So in the end, let's just say that the attempt to make him responsible for Dianne Brimble's death failed due to legal issues. And he pleaded guilty to a charge relating to the supply of drugs.
Through the defence of that manslaughter charge, what was said of the timeline that you've mentioned when it comes to Dianne has lost consciousness, the men shower her? Did they ever fill in any of those blanks?
There were some witnesses that seemed to have come across some of that. Some young women did look into the cabin to look at this person on the floor. They took no action either. And yes, ultimately somebody eventually said, look, this is not looking good. You need to do something about this. And this was one of the 8 men by the name of Charlie, who basically said to Mark, you need to clean up your mess, in such words. And little is known, but it was told that she was showered. Mark and Leo were involved in that, and they said they felt a faint pulse. Again, not quite clear if that is true or it's a convenient excuse after the fact, but then they were embarrassed by it. She was nude, so they dressed her before calling a nurse. You know, clearly not the sort of thing, as somebody said, I think in the inquest, that's recommended by the resuscitation guidelines. But whether that was the ultimate delay that contributed to her death or whether she was already dead, then we will never know.
All these missed opportunities to raise the alarm, does that have a lot to do with the levels of intoxication on board? Not just these 8 men, but passers-by? Does it speak to the culture on cruise ships of the day?
It probably does.
Do you remember what the cruise industry's response was like? Was there an unfavourable spotlight shone on that industry?
For sure. This inquest initially really put P&O in the spotlight, and I think so much so that ultimately they hired a new CEO, and about half or 2/3 of the way through the inquest, they suddenly started cooperating. Suddenly the penny seemed to drop that it was bad for business for them, and they were better off being seen to admit their mistakes and be seen to move on than to try and hold the line. Ultimately, though, cruising has gone from strength to strength in those years post-dating the publicity of the inquest, and since then, the cruise numbers have just grown enormously.
Mark Wilhelm pled guilty to supplying the drugs. 2 more men were convicted for concealing. What penalty did those charges have attached to them, and why did they take 8 years?
All 3 of the men had criminal convictions recorded against them, so that is a penalty of sorts because it does make life difficult. But nobody served time in custody as a result. So there was a mix of a good behaviour bond and a suspended sentence. Why did it take 8 years? Well, the longest period of time was the police investigation before the inquest, which took a very long time, then the inquest, which took a very long time, and after it was referred to the DPP needed to work through these enormous volumes of evidence from the inquest before laying charges, and then the normal court process obviously takes the time it takes. So there was a number of unfortunate delays.
If there is a legacy from this ordeal, did cruise ships become a safer place because of the findings of the inquest?
In terms of systemic changes, P&O, when they reached the point in the inquest where they changed their approach, voluntarily introduced some changes. They put better procedures in place. They trained staff. They added to the security, and then the inquest itself made further recommendations, and Mark Brimble became an advocate and continues to advocate for changes, some of which have been implemented internationally, and I think he's probably still hoping for more in Australia, but I think we've come a long way.
Thanks to Geisha for joining us to discuss this case. If you want to learn more about Dianne's story, Geisha's book, Abandoned: The Sad Death of Diane Brimble, is linked in the episode description. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Emma Gillespie. The executive producer is Gia Moylan, with assistant production by Cassie Merritt. Our audio design is by Rhiannon Mooney. And if you have a case you think we should cover next, please get in touch with us. You can send us an email to truecrime@mamamia.com.au. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.